you guys are here today for cookie science. Thank you for coming to a class. How many are here for the science? How many are here for the cookies? How many are here for both? Okay, fair enough. So I mentioned my name is Stefanie Paganini. I am wearing my old uniform. I am the daughter of pastry chefs and chefs. My mom is Loretta Paganini. She runs the Loretta Paganini School of Cooking. This is us. We were doing a photo shoot. I don't know, I said something funny and you can see she's about to spit on the food. She's laughing so hard trying to hold it in. And I am laughing, although it looks like I'm trying to eat the glass dish. This is as good of photos as we get when we get together. But my mom came to this country with my dad. She is from Italy. She's from a place called Bologna, Italy. And what is magical to me is that my mom was raised in a bakery. My grandmother in Italy was a baker. I get emotional when I talk about her because she was a magical creature. When I was a child, we used to spend our summers in Italy at my grandmother's bake shop. So I have very fond memories of baking. My grandmother I just want to tell you a few minutes about how cool she was. She was one of 8 children, and she started working, one of her sisters was older. She started working with her sister at a bakery and fell in love with it so much she left school and she went and applied at the most famous bakery in Bologna, Italy. And they don't hire women. And she said, well, I will do anything. And they said, well, you can wash dishes. So she started washing dishes and she learned and she kept going until she was the first female that they allowed to actually become the head pastry chef of this bakery. She was the first female allowed into the Italian Bakers Guild. So I am so impressed because my grandmother was this amazing woman breaking ceilings, but also she would give me whatever I wanted out of her bakery. So magical in 2 different ways. So baking was something that was very near and dear to my heart. So when I actually started as a prosecuting attorney for Lake County. And then when my mom was opening Akazi, the professional school where she trains future chefs, she asked me to take 1 year off to help her write contracts and get the school up and running and accredited. And 15 years later, I was running that school. And so was a chef educator for all that time as well in baking. I love teaching about baking for 2 reasons. One, because everyone's happy because I feed them dessert. And also because I think people get nervous about baking. I find people are more confident about cooking because they're like, well, if it seems like it's going south in the pan, I can usually get it back on track. Where baking, people are very afraid when it goes into the oven, they can't do anything, right? It's what's done is done. So I love teaching people about what to look for before it goes in the oven so you can catch the mistake or you can adjust as you're going so that you don't have the mistake on the pan. But here's the secret. The mistakes also taste delicious. And if you see a pastry chef who's very skinny, then you want to find out what's going on because someone else is eating their mistakes, okay? Because they all make mistakes. Find out who it is. Usually they have like a significant other that's like maybe a little more to love, let's say. All right, so enough about me. Let's get on to cookie history. So we're talking today about a very American cookie. My grandmother never made a chocolate chip cookie in her life. She wouldn't know in Italy what they were. But chocolate chip cookies are a very American cookie. The history, and there's been some debunking of this historical fact, but I'm going to hold to it till the day I die, is that Ruth Wakefield is the one who developed the chocolate chip cookie. Now, there are evidence that other supermarkets were selling very similar chocolate chunked cookies all across the United States as far back as the 1800s. So the fact that she's, kind of developing this in the 1930s, we will say the recipe that you see on your chocolate chip cookie bag was developed by Ruth Wakefield. Whether she was the first one to think about putting chunks of chocolate in a cookie is debatable. But she ran a very famous restaurant called the Toll House Restaurant. It was sort of on the highway on the way to the New England area. So people would stop at her restaurant, have a lovely meal, and many celebrities would stop there, so she got kind of famous. She was known for her desserts, and she would make amazing lemon meringue pie, all of these wonderful cakes and desserts. People always made sure they had some of Ruth's desserts, but she wanted something to kind of be a value added to a bowl of ice cream. So if you bought a bowl of ice cream, she would have like a little butterscotch cookie on the side, but she kind of wanted to make it something unique, something special. So she chopped up some Nestle chocolate, a Nestle chocolate bar. She chopped it up and put it into her recipe and called it the chocolate crunch cookie. And it came in her cookbook like she was the Martha Stewart of her day. And it just took off from there. She was featured on podcasts in the olden days were called radio. And they, on Betty Crocker's radio program, it was featured, this recipe, and then people were loving it. And she was letting it be published in newspapers, so people were circulating it, and oh, I found this wonderful recipe, you've got to try it. And when she was releasing a new cookbook, she went into a marketing plan with Nestle and allowed them to print her recipe on the back of their chocolate bars. Well, it became so popular that they decided to make their chocolate semi-sweet morsels. They're not called chips, they're called morsels. And they started putting this recipe on the back of the bag, and that is the recipe that is still on the back of the bag today. Okay? So that is the recipe I'm using. I did not use my own recipe. I used Ruth's recipe. This is a standard recipe. Everyone has it. But this is it. This is what's on the back of the bag. I did modify a little bit in this recipe, just some of the things that I did in her recipe. She has you sifting the flour at the beginning of the recipe and putting it aside to use later. I will forget, so I just put it toward the end and say, okay, this is when you sift and put things together. She does have the vanilla added early on with the sugar. I add it with the egg. So just a few little modifications that I made when I baked it. So this is the recipe that I used, my standard recipe for our cookie experiment today. All right, so now we're going to go through this recipe step by step. We're going to talk about the ingredients. We're going to talk about the different steps we take and why. Because I was that kid. I was the why kid. Why do we do this? Why do we do that? Why do we do this? And so we're going to go through it. We're going to preheat our oven. Why do you think preheating is important? What do you think what purpose does it serve? Get you the right temperature. Yeah, you want the oven at the right temperature. To warm the kitchen a little bit? No. Force you to make the cookies because the oven's on. So
the baking will be done at one temperature.
Exactly. So when you think about a cookie, or you think about a cake, or you think about a bread, so much of it is what happens to these ingredients when they hit the heat. If your heat isn't at the right temperature, it isn't hot enough to cause that chemical reaction, to cause that heat reaction, then you are lessening the impact or lessening the effect that you want out of that baked product. So by giving yourself those few minutes to get the oven at the right temperature, then when your ingredients mix together go in, you're hitting the heat so that the maximum amount of heat is doing the most of what you want to do in a recipe. So in bread, it's oven spring, right? It's going in, the yeast is getting hot, it's releasing all of that gas just as the bread is starting to harden, and then you get this big, beautiful, fluffy bread. So the oven temperature is important. Some people have ovens that are convection, right? They have the big blowing fan. And you guys know that you always have to drop your oven temperature from a recipe when you're doing convection or convention versus convection, because that heat is blowing hotter in that fan. So about 25 degrees. And if not, then you're going to find that things are cooking really fast on the outside and they're still not as cooked on the inside. It's because there's too much hot heat blowing around in there. Okay, so preheat is important. The oven temperature is important. We're setting the stage for success. All right, so when I used to teach baking to pastry students, we learned different mixing methods. And what I wanted my students to be able to do is I could give them a list of ingredients, and I could say creaming method, I could say two-stage method, and they would know exactly how to put those ingredients together and when, because they understood the method I was asking them to do. Cookies are almost unanimously the creaming method. Some of them are dump and mix method, where everything goes in a bowl, you mix it together, you throw it in the oven. But for the most part, it's the creaming method. Why? Why are we forced to mix the sugar and the butter together first? You want to eat the cookies. You don't want to make the cookies, right? So you want to go as fast as you can. So why are we taking this extra 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes to just mix the sugar and the butter? How many of you do it just until they mix together and then you're on to the next ingredient? Okay, you want to give the creaming method its time to shine. Why? It's a mechanical leavening, meaning we are trapping air in your cookie when we're mixing that butter and that sugar together. That trapped air changes the texture of your cookie. It changes the volume of your cookie. So if you're not mixing long enough, you're not volumizing your cookie. Okay? So the mixing method that we're using is creaming, which is taking butter and sugar and mixing it together until it's light and fluffy. Those are literally pastry terms. I am also light and fluffy. So I like them. But what you want to do is you want to mix it for about 3 to 5 minutes to really get the air into it. Okay, so we know we want the creaming method. We know we want to trap air. So we're going to talk about the 2 ingredients we use in the creaming method. The first ingredient that we're using is our sugar. And when we are looking at sugar, sugar comes from either sugar beets, which is the juice of the sugar beet, which is taken out, it's extracted from the beet, and then it's crystallized. It evaporates the moisture, so what you're left with is sugar crystals. Or it's extracted same way by boiling, getting the liquid out of the sugar cane, and then evaporating that liquid in order to get the crystals for sugar. Sugar cane, naturally, the sugar has additives in it, which include molasses. So molasses is a byproduct of the sugar cane. And when you boil your sugar cane, you pull this like brown liquid out. You have to extract the molasses out to get the refined white sugar. In the olden days, they used to do that by tossing the sugar with animal bones that had been charred, like really, really dried out. Because the animal bones, the molasses would then stick to the animal bones and they could remove the liquid that no longer has the molasses in it and make white sugar. That's why a lot of vegans today will be careful when they look at sugar to see whether the sugar is vegan or not, because there are very few these days, but there are some sugar manufacturers that still use an animal product to help refine the white sugar. The white sugar refining process has gotten so good that when they make brown sugar, they are not taking that natural sugar. They're not taking the turbinado or the raw sugar. They are instead extracting everything, making it pure white, and then adding molasses back to it. So when you're buying regular brown sugar, it's not the same as raw sugar, right? It's white sugar that they've added brown sugar to. A little bit of a little bit of molasses gets you light brown sugar. A lot of molasses gets you dark brown sugar. This recipe uses both. Ruth used both white sugar and brown sugar. The brown sugar has a couple of roles. It's going to help with the coloring of our recipe. It's going to help obviously in the sugar process because it is just more white sugar but with a little molasses added to it. Molasses will keep it moist and chewy. It helps with the chewiness. And molasses is a little acidic, so it's going to have the chemical reaction we need for our chemical leaveners later in the recipe. Yeah? Any questions about sugar? Yeah. I put powdered sugar on here because you might hit your cookies with powdered sugar. Powdered sugar is, it used to be that chefs used to take granulated sugar and they'd have to pound it until they got it powdered, and they would use it right away because powdered sugar attracts moisture. So when you're buying produced powdered sugar, your bag of powdered sugar, they put about 3% cornstarch in there to absorb the moisture so your sugar doesn't. So when you're baking with powdered sugar, you have to be careful because you're adding a drying element into your baked goods. So it's not a good swap for granulated sugar. All right, yes?
In the creaming process, sometimes when I cream, I still have like little crystals of sugar. Are you supposed to eliminate that when you cream?
No, the crystals are fine. Okay. It's really about getting that butter blended down really nicely so that what happens is the granulars of sugar are making little holes in your butter, and those holes then are the fat in the butter is trapping air in those little tears, those little holes. So the little granules, they'll melt in the recipe. All right, so as I mentioned, the function of the recipe, it adds sweetness, moisture, it helps to tenderize, it helps to emulsify butter. Another big thing about sugar, we haven't talked about flour yet, sugar fights structure, it fights gluten. So the more sugar in a recipe, the less gluten is going to be strong. So in a cookie recipe, if you add too much sugar, if you don't measure properly, that's when you'll get a lot of spread on your cookie. When people come to me and be like, my cookie failed, I'll be like, one of the things I'll ask is, how much sugar do you have versus the other ratios in there? Because too much sugar breaks down gluten and will help make it weak. Yes?
Does it matter if the butter is just normally softened, or if you put it in the microwave and it gets a little real soft? Does that change the effect?
You win a cookie. Because that, it's a beautiful segue into butter. We're going to talk about butter. Yay! So we have a little experiment. So when we talk about butter in a recipe, I want to show you all this. So this is butter that was cold being mixed into the dough. This is room temperature butter being mixed into the dough. And can you guess what temperature this butter was? Melted. Very good. Exactly, right? It looks a little hot. Well, here's the thing. It got a little melty because it got cold coming here, and I threw it in the microwave to get it melty again, and I lost my chocolate chips in it. But pretend this wasn't microwaved, but this is very much what it looked like. It was very soft. It was very gooey when I made the cookies. And then what I have next to it is each of the cookies that went with it. So we're going to talk about this in a second. But I want to show you what butter does in a recipe. So butter is fat. Right? That's our shortening in this recipe. It's our fat. It's going to add flavor. It's going to add moisture. And as a shortening, what is it shortening? It's shortening gluten strands. So the butter in the recipe, again, is keeping our gluten from overdeveloping, from making too tough of a cookie. It's going to make a flaky cookie, a crumbly cookie. It's going to keep our cookie soft and moist from the fat in it. So it plays both roles, which is lovely. I want to give you a caveat about pastry chefs. We all have very strong opinions, and they're often different. So you will meet me, and I'm going to tell you something about butter, and you're going to meet another chef, and they're going to tell you the exact opposite thing about butter. And that's because we all believe in what works for us, okay? So this is my opinion about butter. Other chefs have different opinions, but I don't let salted butter in my house. I lied. I'm married. I let 1 stick of salted butter in my refrigerator, so my husband stays around because he likes it on his toast. But I don't bake with salted butter. I am an unsalted butter advocate. Why? When you have a salted butter recipe, every manufacturer, whether it's Land O'Lakes or Heinen's, whoever's manufacturing their butter, they're putting a different amount of salt in that butter recipe. There's no standardization of salt in a butter recipe. So if you're baking and you want just a pinch of salt, you can't go in and taste your dough and say, ooh, maybe I need a little more salt, or maybe I need a little less salt. So you want to standardize the amount of salt going into your baked recipe, so you need to add it. You can't rely on some manufacturer butter. 2, salt is a preservative. So butter that is salted can sit on your supermarket shelf about 3 months longer. So you could be potentially getting an older butter. Now, if you buy a pound of butter and it sits in your fridge for 6 years, then maybe you want salted because you want that extra time. What I do is I buy my butter. I usually wait until it goes like on sale. You remember those days of 10 pounds for like $10? Oh, the good old days. But what I would do is I would buy my butter in bulk and I would freeze it, because butter freezes beautifully. And then I would just take a couple sticks out in the refrigerator and use those up within a certain amount of time, and then keep pulling butter from the freezer. But unsalted butter also, salt absorbs moisture, and so manufacturers that are making salted butter can add a little more water to their recipe than unsalted butter. Yeah?
I think I've seen a recipe that calls for salted butter. Now, is there a reason for that, or?
That's chef's choice.
Oh.
They might like it. A lot of times what's really in right now is to have salty sweets, like salted caramel, right? So they're going to maybe use a salted butter because they don't care. They want as much salt because they want you to taste the salt. Ideally in baking, you're not tasting salt. It's there to amplify the other flavors, but it's not there to be its own flavor. All right, so salted butter, unsalted butter, yes?
Are you going to discuss margarine?
No.
Sometimes no answer is the answer.
Once upon a time, butter was very expensive, right? And people used lard. They would use whatever shortening, whether that was animal buttermilk, right? Or any kind of fat that they were getting Maybe they were harvesting pigs and they were using that, or they had chickens and they were using their fat, or they had beef and they were using tallow. They were using that fat in order to be the shortening for their baked goods. And then we were able to use butter, right? Now milk is kind of plentiful and we can make butter from milk, and it's an easier process. It's a more inexpensive process. Yay, we've got it. And then what happened is that butter became a shortage and margarine came in, and someone marketing-wise said, this is healthier for you.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not. It's not. I'm sorry. Unless a doctor has told you to use margarine because you have to reduce fat in your life, and I have feelings about that, but I'm not a doctor, I would stay clear of margarine. I don't bake with it. I don't. Yes?
Crisco shortening. What exactly are you talking about?
Yeah, so Crisco shortening was invented to be a fat that could be shelf stable. So they added, ooh, you guys are asking me really hard questions. Hydrogen, they added an extra hydrogen molecule, maybe. They added something so that it was shelf stable, so that you could cook with it and bake with it without having to put it in your refrigerator, which at the time was needed. I mean, if that's something you were raised with and you love, Crisco fried chicken, or you like baking your pies with Crisco. I have made pie dough with butter, and I've made pie dough with shortening. And the shortening pie doughs are so much prettier because the shortening melts differently, because it's not liquid at room temperature, right? It's stable at room temperature. So when you bake with a shortening crust, it's pretty, it's light. It doesn't have the same browning effect as butter does. Butter is flaky. It looks a little rough on the edges. But flavor-wise, I'm going to go with the butter. I know there's butter-flavored Crisco, but that would probably be the only time that I would advocate for using Crisco, would be if you're doing a really intricate. Have you seen those where they're cutting out shapes, and I mean it's like an entire sculptured pie crust, not butter. You're going to need Crisco for something like that. All right, so here we are to our experiment. We are doing cold, room temperature, and melted. When you use cold butter in this cookie recipe, what ends up happening, and I will pass this around, nobody eat these. We are in cold and flu season, and everyone will be touching it. So if you look at the dough for cold butter, you can actually see chunks of butter in there. Because even though I was creaming it, the butter stayed cold. And so instead of it not melting, but sort of becoming sort of emulsified with the sugar, it stayed in its little chunks. When that goes into the oven to bake, just like a pie dough or a shortbread dough, you will have a large pocket of air, because that butter will melt and that air will be there. So you're going to have a flakier dough. The problem is that air pocket creates an inconsistency in the heating process and in the baking of your cookie. If you are using a cold butter in your chocolate chip cookie recipe, your cookie edges are going to get brown faster, and the center is going to stay kind of puffy and will be a white center. So you're going to get a very almost doughy-like center of your cookie with a very crisp edge. Some people like that. Again, I'm not judging you on your cookie. I'm just telling you what happens depending on the temperature of the butter. The room temperature is sort of the standard. Creaming method is created. The reason we use the creaming method is to make tiny crumb. So the creaming method, having a room temperature butter, which I do is I take my butter out. That's the first thing I measure. Usually it's 2 sticks for this recipe. I chop it up on a cutting board or on a piece of parchment paper. The smaller the butter is, the more surface area and the quicker that butter comes to room temperature. So you can chop it up, let it sit on the counter, measure out all of your other ingredients, and then when you're ready to put your sugar in your mixer, you're going to have your butter at room temperature. It creates a very consistent cookie. Your cookie is going to brown more consistently all over. It's going to spread evenly, and when you open up that cookie, you're going to have very tiny, uniform crumbs. Creaming method is what we use for cakes for that exact same reason, to have tiny crumbs. Cold butter is what we use when we're doing like a muffin or something where we want big, inconsistent crumbs, or pie dough where we want flakes. Yeah?
Question about butter. There's all kinds of brands of butter. Is butter all made the same way, or is the $4 butter differently made than the $2 butter?
Potentially, and also the quality of the ingredients going into the butter. My mom has the privilege to be able to afford Kerrygold butter. I can't. It's a nice butter, right? Because that's the special cows, right? These cows are wandering Irish fields and having frolics with leprechauns, and So, depending on the ingredients they put in, there could be some higher end butters. But for the purposes of a cookie where the butter is not the flavor forward, I'm using my store-bought butter. For this recipe, we use Giant Eagle brand butter. And you'll tell me if you like it or not. All right, so for melted, I do know a New York chef who uses melted butter in their chocolate chip cookie recipe. However, he likes it because everything melts very quickly, everything mixes very quickly together. He does chill his cookie dough overnight. So even though he's breaking down the butter, he's removing the ability to trap air in his cookies, he is chilling it so that butter is hardening a little bit to slow the spread, and he ends up having these massive cookies. They're good. They're also like $6. But so melted, it gives you, there's a very soft dough. When you put it on a cookie sheet, I put it down and it's spreading before it's even hit the heat, right? It's already kind of loosening itself up. Everything is kind of working in it, but again, it's going to give you a very flat cookie. The sugar is not trapped, so the sugar is like having a party in your cookie dough as it's melting, and it gives that crinkle effect on top. So you see how the texture of a melted cookie gives almost like a sugar cookie method, right? Like it's got that kind of crinkly top to it. If you look on this cookie here, you can see that the sugar was so uncontained that it kind of migrated to the edges and almost caramelized, right? That looks good to me, but they all do. All right, so that is temperature. So to answer your question, what do you want your effect to cookie to be? I did an internship when I was studying to be a pastry chef at a bakery, and we had to bake our chocolate chip cookies 3 different ways because some people really like dark brown chocolate chip cookies hard. Some people like them almost like bread dough, like they like them big and fluffy. And some people like a little bit of crunchy, a little bit of soft and everyone feels very strongly because it's however it was made for them in their growing years that they have that nostalgia for that cookie. So I'm not telling you which one is the best way to do it. All right, so butter, we're good on butter? Okay, now we're gonna add eggs one at a time. I didn't bring my eggs. Why? Yeah, they were too expensive, I was afraid. So why do we add them one at a time? Because when you're making a mixture, you're making a ratio. If you add 1 egg at a time, you're giving that egg time to distribute and go into the ingredients. If you add more eggs at one time, then the ingredients are going into your egg mixture. And it seems like, well, that, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. No, it makes a big difference. So eggs 1 at a time, let it mix. We haven't added any flour, so we can mix. We're not worried about mixing. Let the egg fully incorporate before you add your next egg. This recipe called for 2 eggs or $785. And you mix them in. The other thing too is to make sure your eggs are as close to room temperature as possible. I know that's hard sometimes, but if you add cold egg to your mixture, you are just chilling your butter down and you're heading into cold butter territory. So how do you do that? Because you don't want to leave the eggs on the counter, right? That's dangerous. So what I like to do is I'll get a bowl of warm water, not hot. I'm not making hard-boiled eggs, just warm water, and I will put my eggs in the shell in that warm water while I'm getting all my other ingredients together. And that couple minutes of them just sitting in that warm bath kind of gets them warm enough that I can mix them into my room temperature batter. Okay? What do they do in the recipe? They add flavor, they add moisture, they help create structure. Fat is going to give you flavor, it's going to give you color from the egg, but egg is also a protein. And proteins coagulate, right? Especially with the white, the protein of an egg has a very low cook temperature, very low, it's called denatured. Denatures very quickly, and it will help build the structure until the gluten protein has time to denature as well. Oh, vanilla. Y'all, we're gonna spend about 15 minutes on vanilla. Vanilla is my favorite thing in the world. I have only ever contemplated theft once in my life, and that was when I saw a vanilla orchid at the Cleveland Botanical Garden. I was like, I could probably steal this, and then I would have my own vanilla at home. But no, alas, I did not. Or did I? No, I didn't. When we talk about vanilla extract, I love vanilla. Like if you want to get me something for Valentine's Day, don't buy me roses. Buy me vanilla, but the good stuff. So vanilla comes to us naturally from places in the world where the orchid, the vanilla orchid, grows a flower. It has to be pollinated in just a very special way in order for the vanilla bean to grow on that orchid plant. They tried moving, because vanilla, came into Europe alongside chocolate. And so they tried to bring the plants over and grow them in temperate climates, and they could not get the vanilla bean to grow. They got a beautiful flower, but no bean. Beautiful flower, no bean. So they went and they researched it, and it was a Dutch biologist who found out it is a bee, the size of a gnat, that goes in and pollinates vanilla naturally. Okay, so in Mexico, there's a bee. The bee goes in, it pollinates, and you get the beautiful natural vanilla bean. In everywhere else in the world, humans take a tiny little bamboo stick and they go and they hand pollinate all the vanilla orchids to get you the vanilla beans. That is why vanilla is expensive. There are vanilla pirates. They hijack vanilla. Who wants to be a vanilla pirate?
This is like my entire Halloween.
I know, right? A vanilla pirate. Okay, so they go and they hijack vanilla because vanilla is very expensive. You go to the supermarket, right? So what did they do? They created a fake vanilla called vanillin. Vanillin is in most of your produced baked goods in the supermarket. If it's vanilla flavored, flip on the back. It does not say vanilla, it says vanillin. Because vanillin is cheap to produce. Vanilla is expensive to produce. My favorite vanilla comes from the Madagascar Bourbon Islands. They're not drinking there. It's named after the Bourbon Kings. But they have a really beautiful production of vanilla. It's very clean. It's a very good production of vanilla. Be careful of Mexican vanilla. Some of it's very, very good. Some of it isn't, because there is no truth in labeling laws, so they can cut it with whatever they want. It's like olive oil, right? We talk about knowing where your product comes from. Same thing with vanilla. Know the source. Know where it's coming from. Know where it's being made. If you can get a big thing of vanilla for little money, be wary, right? Vanilla this much. My husband bought me one year for Christmas. It looked like a travel toothpaste of vanilla bean paste, which is my favorite thing in the world. I love that so much. I was squeezing it. I double vanilla in all recipes, always, because that's how I roll. But I used it up in a week. And I was like, honey, where did you get this? This was amazing. I need more. And he's like, that was $35. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll use less next time. But I love it. So vanilla is in this recipe as a flavor enhancer. It's going to help with the molasses to give you that wonderful kind of caramel flavor that's in there. In a recipe like this, just a pure vanilla from your supermarket is good because it's not flavor forward. It's a background ingredient. It's a background flavor. I put Madagascar bourbon vanilla in here for you guys. You're welcome. Because I love you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So do you go to like Giant Eagle or something, or do you order it from, those?
Both. If I can get a good Madagascar bourbon vanilla, where I like to find it is in, my favorite place to go vanilla hunting is Home Goods or TJ Maxx. In the back where they have all the weird ingredients?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you can score some Madagascar bourbon vanilla back there. Well, no, don't tell everybody though, okay? Edit that out, Jason. I don't want everyone knowing. But that's where I'll score some. Or online, I'll buy it. One year, not this year, 2 years ago, I bought the beans and I made my own vanilla extract and I gave it out to family and friends. And then my sister, a year later, she handed me the bottle. She's like, what are we getting this year? And I was like, oh no, I did that once, Julia. And she was like, no, I want it every year. So I actually purchased more vanilla and I'm making more vanilla extract for my family for next year. I made my own labels and everything. It was ridiculous, but I loved it. Okay, so now we're back to what we do in a recipe, sifting. Are y'all sifting? You're not sifting. In a cookie, I'm not gonna get mad at you for not sifting. But what sifting does in a recipe, it puts air, right? It's helpful because again, we're trying to lift our cookies. We're trying to make them puffy. It gives us even distribution of all the dry goods we're adding to our cookies. So our flour, our salt, our chemical leaveners, baking soda, anything we're putting in there, we're mixing it together because we don't want to mix in the bowl. If we can mix out of the bowl with our flour before we put it in the bowl, that's going to give us the best quality, because when you mix, you are developing gluten. And in baked goods, the development of gluten, the control of that, is what makes a cookie, a cake, a bread, a hockey puck, a doorstop, okay? So you want to undermix when the flour gets added to moisture, and you want to mix as much as you can before you get it in there. That's why in the in the Toll House recipe, she's mixing in a bowl the baking soda, the salt, and the flour. So she's mixing it together. When you sift, this was the hardest thing to teach my pastry students. They like to sift in the bowl. What happens when you try sifting flour in the bowl? How much of it gets in the bowl? 70% if you're lucky, right? And then you get this halo of flour on your counter. So pretend this is a big sheet of parchment paper. Parchment paper is the other thing I love. If you love me, you can give me parchment paper. So pretend this is a big sheet. This is a half because I use the other half for my cookie sheet. But I put my big sheet of parchment paper down. I sift onto my parchment paper. I lift it up, and then I just tunnel it into my bowl.
The difference between measuring before or after sifting?
Yes, there's a big difference. The recipe, if it's telling you to sift in part of the ingredients, then they're expecting you to measure the sift and then measure. If it's 6 cups sifted flour, then you better sift before you measure. But if it's saying 6 cups flour and then in the recipe, in the instructions, it says sift flour with blah, 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 then you measure, you don't sift beforehand. Because what sifting does is it adds air. It puts little pockets in between the flour particles. And so sifted flour is less volume of flour than unsifted flour.
What about the pre-sifted that it says on the bag?
That the flour's been pre-sifted, I mean, unless you bought it from the guy sifting it, I would sift it again. Because it's going to be settling as it's traveling. Okay? So, let's talk about chemical leaveners. So we talked about mechanical leavening. What was the mechanical leavener in our cookie recipe?
Creaming.
Creaming, very good. Those of you who answered that correctly, you get a cookie. All the hands are up. We also have chemical leaveners. In our recipe, we are not using yeast, which you know is alive, right? Yeast is alive. I would teach my children's classes, and I would get in trouble, but I didn't care. I would teach them that yeast would take in sugar, and it would eat so much sugar, it would get a tummy ache, and it would burp. And then the yeast burping is what made the gas, right? Which chemically is true, although a little, and the kids would go home, Mom, guess what? Yeast burps. I'm like, we learned other things. But baking powder is baking soda. It's just baking soda 2 ways. It's regular baking soda, and then it's baking soda that they've added an acid crystal to it. Because in order for baking soda to activate, it needs an acid. So it used to be only baking soda, and then you would see all the 1940s housewives running to the oven and hoping that cake would rise while the baking soda is activating. And if the baking soda activates before the cake coagulates, then they would get that sunk middle, right? But someone said, could we make this process a little easier? So they just added the acid crystal to the baking soda. So as it's baking, that acid crystal is melting right next to the baking soda because it's attached to it, and it's causing that chemical reaction. So baking powder is baking soda, and baking soda with an acid crystal, both in the container. Baking soda by itself needs an acid. In our chocolate chip cookie recipe, it is the molasses in a cookie. But I thought this would be kind of fun. I'm going all Bill Nye the Science Guy. This is baking soda. Here's an acid. Do you see him? Yeah, does anyone see it? The bubbles, bubbles, bubbles. Okay? So that's what's happening in your cookie. That's what is helping keeping your cookie from spreading too much, from getting too dense and getting too crispy, is that chemical reaction. Okay? So the molasses. So don't take the brown sugar out of this recipe because then you won't have that chemical reaction with the baking soda. All right, so last thing I want to talk about is flour. I drew this. This tells you why I am not a famous artist somewhere. This is as close as I get to drawing. All right, so this is flour. And what these are 2 proteins that you find in wheat flour. So here in the United States, most of our flour is made with a hard wheat, and that wheat has 2 proteins in it, gluten and gliadin. I don't know if you can see that in that green. When those two, they're like the wonder twins. When they activate with moisture, water, melted butter, something liquid, they combine to make gluten, which is a protein. Proteins look like corkscrews, like this. And when you're mixing it, those corkscrews, like a really bad slinky, they get all tangled on each other, right? And they get real tight. The more you mix, the more you're throwing those gluten corkscrews at each other, and the tighter they're getting. We want some structure, because what gets trapped in there is that moisture that's hitting it. We get moisture, we get fat, we get sugar, we get air trapped into our structure. So that's what's going to help lift it. We're going to get the air is going to help push it up as it heats up into steam. And we've got our cookie will have a structure to it. Too much, and then it's too tight, right? And then it's dry, it's too hard, too much structure. So that's why you don't want to overmix. That's why once you add the flour to your recipe, you're mixing just to combine. And most recipes will tell you that, because you don't want to overdevelop the gluten. You don't want too much mixing, too much corkscrews getting trapped against each other. Yes?
Do you add all your flour at once, or do you add it in increments?
I add it all at once. I'll add, because I have this thing, right? And I'll go like this and add it, and then just until it's mixed. I use a planetary mixer at home. The brand that I use is a KitchenAid, where it spins like this, right, on its axis, and then spins like an orbit around the bowl. So for every hand stroke, a KitchenAid is 10 to 12 strokes. So I have to be very careful I don't overmix. If you're making it by hand, you have a little more wiggle room, because you're doing 1 stroke at a time. Okay, so we talk about flour. Which flour are we using? All purpose, right? All purpose. Why? Bread flour has more gluten protein in it. So if you're using bread flour, and some chocolate chip cookie recipes call for bread flour, they might have more sugar to combat the extra gluten, but I use King Arthur as my standard. King Arthur has 12.7% of gluten in their bread flour, so it's between 12 to 14%. All purpose is 10 to 12. And then they remove gluten from flour in order to make cake flour. So that's why it's so expensive. A human's going in and not by hand, but they're going in and removing gluten to make cake flour, which is between 7 and 10%. Yes?
Okay, for health purposes, what effect would whole wheat flour have in changing all of it? Would it change the taste or the way it bakes? Or?
I appreciate whole wheat flour when I'm trying to be healthy. As a pastry chef, I hate it. Here's why. Whole wheat flour is exactly what it means. When they make regular flour, right, all-purpose flour, refined flour, they're removing the shell, they're removing the outside, and inside the flour you have something called the sperm, and it's the endosperm, and it's what makes more wheat. So when they are refining their flour, they're removing the shell, they're removing the bran, and they're removing the endosperm, because the endosperm spoils quickly. So by removing the endosperm, your flour will last longer, and it's got a better shelf life, and it doesn't spoil as quickly, and so that's beneficial to them and to us. So that's why we remove the endosperm. The bran, the skin on the outside of the wheat, is horrible to gluten production. It goes in, and those corkscrews, it just slices them like a razor. So if you're using whole wheat, you're going to have a very dense product, because you're cutting your gluten and it's compacting. And bran doesn't dissolve. We don't digest it. That's why we're like, eat your bran, right? Because it keeps things moving. So in baking, it's terrible, unless a recipe is designed to combat those things. I would not use it as a replacement in a regular recipe. It will wreak havoc on the ratio of your recipe. Okay? Yes?
I know professionals tend to use King Arthur flour. Can you discuss the difference between that and like gold medal and Pillsbury?
I think we're snobs when it comes to flour. King Arthur is a very consistent product. Up until 10 years ago, I would have said I trust it implicitly, but they just had a recall within the last 5 years. So where in the past I would say, when I'm buying flour, that I'm buying 50-pound bags, 100-pound bags of flour, I want to make sure it's not getting recalled, right? Because that's gone out. Yeah. So King Arthur's a really good company to their employees. Their employees are part of their company. They buy stock in their company. It's a national company. It's in the United States, so I know that flour is coming from the United States. I know that it's a U.S. product, so I feel good about that. But as far as in a cookie recipe, I mean, we didn't. Oh no, I asked them to buy King Arthur, but you can use gold medal.
So the bleached as compared to unbleached flour, what's?
It's aesthetics. Unbleached is healthier for you. If you can afford to buy the unbleached, I would. The bleached is because we like white sugar, we like white flour, we like our product to be colored only by the caramelization, the Maillard reaction, and not the bread, not the flour. But unbleached is what I would buy at home. All right, don't take your cookie off the sheet pan. Let it cool on the sheet pan. You need to take it out of the oven before it's dark, dark, dark. Because it's going to have carryover heat. Just like meat rests on the counter, right? And you let it finish cooking. Your cookie on your sheet pan has carryover heat. When you pull that thing off, and using parchment, it helps. Sometimes you need to because you've accidentally put it in there too long. You can slide the parchment right off. You can, well, use a glove, right, obviously, and you can go, oh gosh, and then let it cool that way. But when you're trying to take cookies that are warm and the steam is still in there and the gluten, everything hasn't coagulated and cooled down, you are affecting the structure of your cookie. So if you can remember to, leave it in the pan, pull it out a minute or two early and let it finish cooking in the pan, on your cooling rack or on your stove while you're waiting for it. It's my little hack. And that's it. Any questions? Yeah.